Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who is joining us here at the Festival of Social Sciences. And we'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you to this session, which is titled Environmental Justice and the Caste Question. My name is Vasna Ramasa, and I'm an assistant professor at Lund University in Sweden, and I'll be moderating the session. We're very delighted to have the opportunity today to talk of the very important question of caste in relation to environmental justice, something that's not often brought together. However, in this time of Black Lives Matter movements, the COP26 that is happening currently in Glasgow, these issues are fundamental and these are crises that we have to address. However, in a lot of the discussions about intersectionality, caste is often left as a slightly unique system. And with this presentation, we actually want to draw out the patterns of oppression and domination that underlie caste, but also relate very strongly to other issues in terms of gender, race, class, and so forth. All of the work that is going to be presented here by our three main presenters relates to an upcoming book. It's currently at the press, Climate Justice in India, and the speakers are all authors of different chapters, and Prakash Keshwan is the editor of the book. We also have the privilege of having a number of poems that are going to be shared with you through the session. So we welcome you to sit with us for an hour, maybe a little bit more, and then we will go forward with that. So I will get us started as quickly as possible and really just welcome our first speaker, who is Prakash Keshwan. He's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science. He's also the co-director of the research program on economic and social rights, Human Rights Institute, University of Connecticut, Stores. He's the author of Democracy in the Woods, Environmental Conservation and Social Justice in India, Tanzania, and Mexico. And as I mentioned, he is also the editor of the book Climate Justice in India. He's also the co-editor of the journal Environmental Politics and a member of the editorial boards of Progress in Development Studies, Earth System Governance, Sage Open, and Humanities and Social Sciences Communication. Prakash, thank you very much for joining us today. I'll give you the platform to give us a bit of context to this work in environmental justice and caste and the book project that you three have been involved in. So I hand over to you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. And we are still awaiting, hopefully, Jacinta Carqueta is going to join us. And I particularly wanted to sort of recognize Jacinta's presence here and her inspiring work. The more you read about her life story, her poetry, her work, the more inspiring it gets. So, and we are fortunate to be in a position to be able to get into these conversations with poets, and I'll show you some artwork, and there are more poets who are going to be part of the edited volume 2. So this is a very unique experiment in the realm of academic publishing, and before I start the point, PowerPoint, I really wanted to make this point about the fact that this was not a donor-funded workshop or conference. It was not even a journal special issue that was later on put together into an edited volume. Nobody got paid anything in this process, and including the artists and the poets and the translators. And I gave away my royalties so that we could add another layer of copy editing and proofreading, because we have activists and academics who write in strange language and all sorts of things, and academics like myself. And so in that sense, I'm really privileged to present to you an overview of this edited volume. And I will try to sort of just give a very short overview before turning over to my co-contributors to the volume. I am going to share the PowerPoint right away. Okay, are you able to see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so so first of all, to sort of address the elephant in the room, you've all heard about climate justice being a colonial, a product of colonial legacies and the need to address those colonial legacies. And since the early 90s, the Center for Science and Environment in Delhi has been a global leader in providing scientific evidence for climate justice. And so, and you've all seen these graphs which show that India, and especially India's poor people, have contributed nothing to the ongoing climate crisis. And in fact, if you account for the nature-friendly lifestyles and livelihoods of Adivasis and the contribution that peasant agriculture makes to climate restoration, soil restoration, carbon sequestration, poor people have actually subsidized the rest of the world in terms of dealing with climate crisis. So there is no doubt that there's a major global injustice that needs to be rectified. But the problem is that as long as we look at climate justice from an international perspective, we actually miss a lot. And so here, I quickly helpful to define climate justice as a framework where those who are most affected by climate crisis are in the first place recognized as legitimate actors and stakeholders. And then they are able to participate in framing, debating, developing, and implementing climate action. And if all of that happens, then we can really address the unequal distribution of costs and burdens of climate change and climate action. And so, this whole idea that, the powerful, rich white people in global north, or even educated scientific research expertise owners in the brown world, they're going to save the poor people, has not proved to be true in the 30-year-long history of climate negotiations. And so the main point here is that climate justice is not just an ethical or moral concern for the global north, but we need to recognize the human agency, and we need to attribute blame and responsibility where it is due. So climate justice is a complex process. It involves social, political, legal, economic, and environmental dimensions. And in this volume, we try to sort of do this kind of holistic thinking on the question of climate justice. So this is one of the artworks that artist and scholar Nitin Donald has kindly shared with us, and he's given us permission to include this in the book, even though this particular piece is so hard-hitting that I think some folks somewhere in the line are having some second thoughts. But this actually shows globe as a sort of earth as a Brahminical creation. The line that you see in the middle is the sacred thread, the Jnehu, and the tree on which you have a couple from young couple from Dalit young couple hanging to the tree because their love was not acceptable to the higher caste. That tree is actually the choti, the hair bund of the traditional conventional Brahminical form. And so this is symbolic of how environmentalism can be tyrannical, right? So that whole discussion about including Dalits and including Adivasis and including indigenous people in the process of climate, that sort of, doesn't quite get at how serious the problem is. And so here is Nitin Donald, so that you can all see him and sometimes find and meet him and shake his hand maybe. So, what we tackle some of the largest climate problems and show how climate justice can be embedded within those mainstream climate discussions. So Vasudha Chauthuray's chapter talks about the extractive regimes in coal heartlands. And so this whole discussion of just transition is not just about protecting jobs. It's not just even about health. It is about the political economy that has exploited both the marginalized groups from lower caste, so-called lower caste and tribes, but have also maintained the structures of the power that allow for extraction and exploitation. And you can see the pictures and the slogans and the jumlas that are being thrown around freely. Another chapter by Rahul Sharma and Parth Bhatia from Center for Policy Research in New Delhi looks at this whole question of energy transition from the power side. So the first chapter was from the coal angle, and this is from the angle of making the transition in the power grid and in the mainstream power reforms in India. And what these authors show is that the whole energy transition is being sort of retrofitted into the pre-existing structures of dominance and powers of centralized control by state and private actors. So despite all the rhetoric you hear, there are no serious attempts to actually embed questions of justice and thinking about justice within power reform. Then we have a chapter from Vaishnavi Bahal, a young activist scholar, and myself, looking at questions of water justice. And we focus squarely on basic minimum access to safe drinking water. And what we show is that simple access to water is driven by the intersections of gender, caste, class, and climate change. So again, it's not just about scarcity and how we make sure that poor people are not sort of, affected adversely because of scarcity. Because as most of you probably already know, that India's Dalits, Adivasis, women are already facing these kinds of injustices day in and day out. Climate change only worsens it. Then chapter by Eric Chu and Kavya Michael, they talk about, they take a long sweep view of climate adaptation projects in urban areas over past 2 decades or so. And they show that even though, again, there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of vocabulary, but slowly climate adaptation in urban areas is moving increasingly in the direction of technocratic top-down schemes that are sponsored by international donors and are mostly being implemented via public-private participation plans. And so again, justice in the context of urban climate action is mostly sort of thinking about the vulnerabilities and talking about vulnerabilities. And I'll come back to this point about talking about vulnerabilities and sort of talking about participation as if that talk itself is going to create justice. So in each of these chapters, you'll see that we grapple with real big ticket issues in India's climate adaptation and climate responses. You'll hear from Ashleesha, who along with Kavita has written this fantastic chapter on agroecological justice and women's land rights. And of course, you have Srilata here, who will talk about caste justice being at the center of climate justice. So as I said, we inspired by some of the other work I'm doing with my colleagues in Climate Justice Network, we included lots of arts and poetry in the edited volume. And I want to read this one poem by Waharu Sonwane, who's again a long-standing activist, peasant, Adivasi activist. And he wrote this poem in Marathi, and it was translated by Bharat Patnankar and Gail Omwet, who recently, unfortunately, left us. The poem is called Stays, and I'll read it quickly because my time is limited. We did not go to the stays, nor were we called. With a wave of the hand, we were shown our place. There we sat and were congratulated. And they, standing on the stage, kept on telling us of our sorrows. Our sorrows remained ours. They never became theirs. So this is stays, and this cuts to the heart of this whole rhetoric of participation and inclusion, where we have failed. And this includes many of the social movements where we have failed to actually create and respect and recognize grassroots leaders like Waharu Sonwane, and with the exception of folks like Gail, who spent a lifetime working with grassroots leaders. To conclude, we are So this was all from me, and I'll leave you with this slide. Check us out and please connect. We will continue to have these conversations as we go along. Thanks very much. Over to you, Vasna.
Thank you very much, Prakash, and for giving us an overview and introduction, showing the multiple dimensions of environmental injustice being experienced in India, but also how there's a number of different vulnerabilities that connect to each other. I think in this time of globalization, of so much social media and so much news, we can sometimes become a little bit immune to what it means in terms of lived experiences that people have of these kinds of environmental injustice. And so it is a privilege when artists and poets like Jacinta are able to share with us, give us the insights to the emotions behind it. Unfortunately, Jacinta is not able to actually join us right now on this webinar. We are hoping that she's still able to connect in a little while, but I would like to take the opportunity to introduce her a little bit before we hear some video recordings that she made of her poetry. So Jacinta Katze is a poet, writer, and freelance journalist representing an Aryan Adivasi community of West Singhbum district in India. She writes in Hindi. Her poems highlight the injustices committed on the Adivasi communities along with their struggles. Jacinta is the author of 2 bilingual, Hindi and English, full-length collections of poems, Angkor and Jordan Ki Jameen. And you can find her books, I believe, online as well for purchase. So what we will do now is first have sharing of Jacinta and recordings of her poems in Hindi, and afterwards I will read them out in English. And in doing that, I must recognize the work that's been done by Bhumika Chawla D'Souza in making those translations. So we'll start with the first poem, which in English is titled Care.
परवाह माँ, एक बोझा लकड़ी के लिए क्यों दिन भर जंगल छानती, पहाड़ लांघती, देर शाम घर लौटती हो? माँ कहती है, जंगल छानती, पहाड़ लांघती, दिन भर भटकती हूँ, सिर्फ सूखी लकड़ियों के लिए, कहीं काट न दूँ कोई जिंदा पेड़।
Care. Mother, why do you scour the jungle, climb over hills all day, and come home late with a load of wood, just one bundle? In reply, Mother says, I scour the woods, climb over hills, wander the whole day for dry firewood, just one bundle, as I'm weary of cutting a living tree out of care for my jungle. We now move on to the second poem, Bloodstained Rivers.
लाल नदियाँ। हजारों पेड़ों की लाशें गिराकर खून से सने हाथ चुपचाप धुलते हैं सारंडा की नदियों में। तब दहाड़े मारता है लहूलुहान पानी किनारों के कांधे पर सिर रखकर, और सारा जंगल लाल हो उठता है। सखुआ की डाली ठोंकती है जीवित स्मृतियों का पर्चा दरख्तों पर। एक आवाज हहराती है गवाह बनकर समय के कटघरे में, और दम तोड़ते सबूत इंतजार करते हैं अंतिम सांस तक न्याय के कदमों की आहट का। तब भरोसे की आंखें सांझ बन डूबने लगती हैं सूरज के साथ। जब सूखे कागजों पर समझौतों का ठप्पा लगाने लगता है ठहाके, सारी पड़तालें दुबक जाती हैं। भूखी हड़तालें अंधेरे में चबाने लगती हैं उम्मीदों की टुकड़ियाँ, और लगातार खून के आंसू रोती रह जाती हैं लाल नदियाँ।
Blood-stained rivers. Hands stained with the blood of 1,000 slaughtered trees quietly wash themselves clean in the rivers of Saranda, and the waters drenched in blood bewail, weeping on the shoulders of riverbanks, and the entire forest sees red. Boughs of the sakura tree nail posters of memories that once were, but have now gone missing. A voice quivers in the witness box of time, and evidences on the brink of death await in vain until their last breath, the footsteps of justice forthcoming. The light of trust in eyes grows dim, hope fades, heart sinks in the evening shroud, when the seal on fate's bargained on dry papers roars with laughter out loud. Eyes seeking the truth cower, starving voices raised in protest nibble at moments of hope and solace, while endless streams of desperate tears weep the blood-stained rivers. We will now go to huffing and puffing machines.
हाँफती मशीनें। मशीनें पेड़ों को उखाड़ चुकने के बाद हाँफती हैं। मशीनें पेड़ों को उखाड़ चुकने के बाद हाँफती हैं। अब हाँफती मशीनें ढूंढती हैं कहीं कोई पेड़ की छां।
Huffing and puffing machines. Having done with uprooting the trees, out of breath are the machines, and now these huffing and puffing machines are searching for the cool shade of a tree. And the last poem in this section, No One Ever Saw Me.
यही कहीं इसी शहर में गायब होती गौरैया ने देखा शहर के अंदर कटकर गिरा कोई जंगल, जिसके निशानों के पास बैठकर उसकी स्मृति के साथ यह शहर अपनी शाम गुजारता है। इसी शहर के अंदर गिरा एक पेड़ समय से पहले, उसकी धड़ाम की आवाज से जरा सा हिला यह शहर अपनी नींद में। इसके अंदर दम तोड़ रही हैं नदियाँ, और अपनी स्मृतियों में वह रख लेता है उन्हें जिंदा, ताकि अपने बच्चों की कल्पनाओं में खींच सके कोई जीवित रेखा चित्र किसी नदी का। गायब होती गौरैया ने देखा शहर की भीड़ के हाथों तितलियों को मरते हुए, और बच्चों ने देखा मैदानों को शमशानों में बदलते हुए। बच्चों का विश्वास है जब तक बचा है पृथ्वी पर एक भी फूल, तितलियां मर नहीं सकती। वे लौटती हैं दुनिया के किसी भी कोने से, इसलिए हाथों में फूल लेकर वे ढूंढ रहे हैं तितलियों की कब्र यही कहीं इसी शहर में।
Vasna, I apologize. I think I played somewhere in the city. So if you could read that now, please. Sorry for that.
Of course. So I will read the next poem, somewhere in the city. The eyes of a disappearing sparrow see, in the city, a forest axed down to the ground, besides whose last vestiges the city sits with its memories and whiles away the evening. In this very city, a tree fell away before its time. The slumbering city stirred but a little as it came crashing down. A death sentence for rivers in the city, yet it keeps them alive in memories, so it may draw from this collection a live imagery of a river for the imagination of its future generations. The disappearing sparrow sees, at the hands of the crowded city, the death of butterflies, and the children watch playgrounds turn into cemeteries. The children believe, so long as there remains but one flower on earth, the butterflies shall not perish, for they return from any corner of the world. And so, holding a flower in their hands, they look for the grave of butterflies somewhere in the city. And so with this poem, we will now move on to the next presentation scheduled. And it's my pleasure to invite our second speaker, which is the host and coordinator and organizer of the session itself, Ashleesha Katze. Ashleesha is a lecturer in India and Global Affairs at King's India Institute, King's College London. She has previously held research positions at Lund University in Sweden and University College London. She currently leads a research group on cities, climate, and capital in the Indian Ocean world. She's a convener of the Confronting Caste series, which is a set of conversations in podcast and panel formats that seeks to center the analytic of caste in historical and contemporary contexts. Ashleesha, we're happy to hear you talk a bit more about environmental justice and caste.
Thank you so much, Vasna, and thank you to Prakash for inviting me to contribute to this very exciting and much needed and well-timed volume. And thank you to everybody who's joining us today. I'm going to very briefly try and summarize my contribution to the volume and also sort of contextualize that in our contemporary times. So there are broadly 3 points that I want to make, and I don't really have a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to speak to the screen and hope to hold your attention. So there are broadly 3 points that I have tried to make in my chapter and that I want to make today here. So the first point is that when we speak about environmental justice or environmental issues of any kind in the context of India today, that conversation seems to be largely divorced from or bereft of any reference to caste. And this is not sort of an accident. This is something that has come about through a long historical process, which also I will get into. But this is the first point, which is that we treat environmental issues and questions about the environment as entirely separate from questions about caste. And there is of course, there's a resistance to talking about caste with regard to anything. There is a sort of a tendency to pretend that we live in a post-caste society, which of course we don't. Anybody who has kind of any acquaintance with current affairs in India would, very easily be able to detect that. But there is especially a resistance in talking about caste in the context of environmental issues outside of, very small kind of academic activist circles. And this is a problem. And one of the examples that I want to draw your attention to from contemporary news cycles is about the issue of firecracker bans in the context of Diwali. And if you look at the coverage that this issue gets in the media, or even the conversations that take place on social media, there are broadly kind of 2 stances that people take. And one is sort of pro-environment, where people support the ban, stating pollution and air quality issues and things like that. And on the other hand, you have those who oppose the ban, saying either that this is, hurting religious sentiments, which of course are specific, religious sentiments of specific caste groups, usually, who have that kind of dominant presence in the public discourse to air such views. But also sometimes comments are made about how the firecracker production industry is, a large sector and it is valued at such and such amounts, and how a ban can be detrimental economically. But in all of this, there is no attention paid to the fact that most of the labor in this industry is drawn from marginalized and disenfranchised caste groups, Dalit, Adivasi, Bahujan caste groups. Most of this labor is also actually gendered, and it's child labor as well as women's labor, under extremely difficult circumstances in very extractive forms. And no matter which way we try to resolve this issue, there is no good outcome for this category of people. So if we impose a ban, then of course there is a hazard to their livelihood, and they are not able to earn the money that they need to survive, because of course they are hourly paid and very poorly paid and very precariously employed workers with seasonal employment. But on the other hand, if we can continue with the production of firecrackers under the conditions that it takes place now, it is also an hazard to the same group of people in terms of health and well-being, because the production itself is a very, very toxic process, and there are no safeguards involved, and there is no regulation of the industry as such. But there is this aspect, the caste element of it, the fact that the industry is based on a caste structure, and that it is only the viewpoints of those who are using the firecrackers and those who are owning the factories and making profits out of the industry are the only viewpoints that we see represented in the dominant media, in the mainstream media, and we see no representation of the working class, which again overlaps very clearly with marginalized and disenfranchised caste groups. I think it's one of the most succinct examples that is live right now in the context of Diwali, where we see how environmental issues are deliberately divorced from questions of caste. So that brings me to the second point of why is it so and how does it continue to be so? And the point that I'm making in my chapter in the book is that a large reason behind this is that most of the policy institutions, the decision-making institutions, our courts, our bureaucracy, judiciary, the civil services, even the activist kind of environment ecosystem is largely dominated by elite caste individuals who can afford to remain ignorant or turn their attention away from the question of caste. But this did not sort of suddenly happen or magically happen in this way, or it's not that there is something intrinsic in the elite caste that make them particularly well suited to these positions of power. There is actually a very long history of displacement, disenfranchisement, dispossession, extraction that has led to this reality today. And this is the process that I have spent much of the chapter trying to trace. And I'll give very short examples of this. So some of the examples that come to us readily are from the provinces of Punjab and Bengal. And it takes us back to the colonial times when the colonial bureaucracy was being set up and the colonial property regime was being put in place. And in both of these provinces, which were two really big main provinces in colonial India, we see a large-scale displacement of marginalized and disenfranchised groups, such as Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi pastoralists and agricultural laborers who did have community rights to common land. They had access to land and natural resources, traditionally customary rights, which was systematically displaced, and they were systematically rendered landless, and they were systematically rendered resourceless to the benefit of elite caste groups, who in turn facilitated the establishment of the colonial regime and benefited and continue to benefit from the establishment of the colonial regime. And it is this mass widespread landlessness that eventually brings us to the current situation in India, where you have urban centers which are with a very, very large population of itinerant circular migrants. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, were aware of the migrant crisis that took place at the peak of COVID in India last year, continuing into this year, where essentially at a few hours notice, an extremely large number of people, we don't even know the exact numbers because our state does not bother to count them, but running into hundreds of millions, people were rendered without livelihoods, without any security of housing, without any security of food, and had to walk back to their villages from where they had migrated into the cities to build the very cities that they are then disenfranchised from. And we continue to see this kind of process where property holding or ownership of businesses and ownership of property becomes the logic for claims to rights. And because the section of people, the caste subaltern, I will broadly call them, which of course includes Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi groups, because they have deliberately been kept away from these property rights through this historical process, their claim to rights continues to be rejected by this establishment that is now peopled by individuals from the elite caste. And I want to give a specific example, which is the example of the Pushdavasi in Delhi, which is an informal settlement that came up on the banks of the Yamuna starting in the 80s when the Asian Games were held in Delhi. And many workers came into the city to build the infrastructure that was needed for hosting these games. And thereafter, they settled in that area, and newer waves of migrant workers continue to come and live in these informal settlements. So most of the pollution that was the pollution of the river Yamuna in Delhi, it is well documented that most of it takes place because of discharge of effluents from industries and from elite housing complexes, which do not treat their chemical wastes and simply discharge them into the river water. And yet, a group of factory owners in this industrial zone in the periphery of Delhi went to the Delhi High Court claiming that it was actually the informal settlements or slums, as they are referred to, which were the main reasons for pollution, and the slums should be removed. And even though there was adequate and sufficient documented evidence that this is in fact not true, the Delhi High Court ruled in favor of the factory owners, displacing the slums and saying that even if they are not directly causing pollution, they, by their very existence, are a polluting influence. And there's a very clear connection here to the caste ideology of purity and pollution, which here gets institutionalized in the judgment provided by the Delhi High Court. So this is one of many, many examples that we see from all across cities in India. And I'm not going to elaborate on that anymore, but this kind of very briefly traces the process of how caste as a structure, as a system of power, has been used deliberately to disenfranchise a large section of people, but also to keep their voices and their interests away from the pertinent questions of policy today, including the questions of environmental justice. So that then brings me to the last point that I want to make, which is that we cannot go on talking about environment and climate change and managing climate change and adaptation and mitigation and all of these things without squarely and directly talking about caste justice, especially in the context of India. And this has happened to some extent in the international context, where there is the established idea of common but differentiated responsibility, where there is an acknowledgement that there is a history of colonialism, of imperial extraction, of uneven development, which has to be acknowledged when forming policy and when entering into debates around this issue. And this acknowledgement has not happened in India. And it is time that we squarely push for it and bring the question of caste to the forefront of environmental justice, because it is otherwise entirely possible, for example, to reduce emissions, to even achieve net zero emissions as promised by our Prime Minister recently by year 2070. It is possible to do that while continuing to displace and disenfranchise and exploit Dalit, Adivasi, Bahujan populations. It is possible to convert from fossil fuels into green energy systems while still continuing to extract labor from these people, from disenfranchising these people, without essentially changing anything about the bureaucracy, the judiciary, or any of the systems that hold power in the running of the country. Without changing any of that and without addressing this issue of caste injustice, it is possible to produce outcomes that arguably could be in favor of tackling climate change, or could even be mitigating climate change or resolving the issue in some senses without getting into the question of caste at all. And this is something that we need to absolutely stand against. And this is why we need to reimagine environmental justice and climate justice as caste justice. So I'll end there for now.
Thank you very much, Srilata. I think you did an excellent job of showing how caste is invisibilized in social and ecological relations, but also the structures that both create and perpetuate these injustices, something that we need to be able to address and confront head on. I'm really delighted to say that Jacinta Kirkata has been able to join us on the webinar. Jacinta, I don't know if you would, I've already introduced you to the audience by describing the work that you're doing, but I don't know if you would like to just say a few words. We've had the privilege of listening to your first set of poems now, and we'll go on into a second set, but I'd like to maybe open the opportunity for you to just say hello and maybe a little bit about where your poems have come from. I don't know if you have the possibility with your internet to do so. Okay, maybe in the interest of time, we will continue and then give Jacinta the word a bit later on. I'm also very conscious that the program for this session said that we would run for an hour, and we are getting fairly close to that time and haven't gone through the last poems and our speaker as well. So I hope that you will bear with us. We have the opportunity of keeping the Zoom running for a bit longer, and it would be fantastic if you were able to join us. For those who might not be able to join us, there will be a recording of the session that will be available online. But I think we will now move on to further reading of Jacintha's poems. And if we can start with The Mystery of the Forest Bamboos.
I hope I have the right one this time. Sorry.
पहाड़ी बांसों का रहस्य। मैं कुरवा में सो रहा था। अचानक जमीन हिलने लगी। देखा जमीन उखाड़ती मशीन के पंजों पर अपने खेत को। उस टुकड़े के साथ मैं भी लटका था मशीन पर। तब महसूस हुआ मुझे अपनी जमीन सहित उखड़ जाने का दर्द। मेरे पूर्वजों की देह टुकड़ों में काटी जा रही थी। मैंने देखा उन्हें करोड़ों में बिकते हुए। खरीदारों की भीड़ नीचे शहर बन गई थी। लगा मेरे ही शरीर का हिस्सा कतरों में बिक रहा हो। पीढ़ियों का भविष्य पहाड़ों की तलहटी में बेच रहा था बांस। तब छूटते ही मशीन के पंजों से मैंने उठा लिया बांस। इस बार ये बांस बाजार नहीं जाएंगे। जंगलों के अंदर वे बनेंगे हर हाथ का तीर धनुष। तब पहली बार समझ में आया पूर्वजों के रक्त से सिंचित पहाड़ों पर उगे असंख्य बांसों का रहस्य।
The Mystery of the Forest Bamboos. As I lay in the Kurwa field in sweet slumber, I felt the earth beneath quake and tremor, and I saw on the sweeping claws of an excavator my fields from its very roots severed. On that machine hung not just that piece of land, but I as well. And I realized then the agony of being uprooted from one's soil. The body of my ancestors was being rent and dismembered, and I watched the pieces sell for millions. The crowd of buyers turned into a teeming multitude, and I felt as if my own body were torn into a million pieces and sold. At the foothills of the mountains, the new generations sell off their bamboos to ensure a secure future. Breaking free from the machine claws, I picked up a bamboo and swore, these bamboos shall go to the markets no more. In the forest they will remain this time and become bows and arrows for each hand. And then, for the very first time, the mystery revealed itself of countless bamboos lining the hills and nurtured by ancestors with their very blood. We will now move on to Land of the Roots.
जड़ों की जमीन। वे पेड़ों को बर्दाश्त नहीं करते। वे पेड़ों को बर्दाश्त नहीं करते क्योंकि उनकी जड़ें जमीन मांगती हैं।
Land of the roots, the sight of trees they cannot stand, for the roots of trees, they claim the land. And the next poem, The River, the Mountain, and the Bazaar.
नदी, पहाड़ और बाजार। गांव में वो दिन था इतवार, मैं नन्ही पीढ़ी का हाथ थाम निकल गई बाजार। सूखे दरख्तों के बीच देख एक पतली पगडंडी, मैंने नन्ही पीढ़ी से कहा, देखो यही थी कभी गांव की नदी। आगे देख जमीन पर बड़ी सी दरार, मैंने कहा इसी में समा गए सारे पहाड़। अचानक वो सहम के लिपट गई मुझसे, सामने दूर तक फैला था भयावह कब्रिस्तान। मैंने कहा, देख रही हो इसे, यही थे कभी तुम्हारे पूर्वजों के खलिहान। नन्ही पीढ़ी दौड़ी, हम आ गए बाजार। क्या क्या लेना है, पूछने लगा दुकानदार। भैया थोड़ी बारिश, थोड़ी गीली मिट्टी, एक बोतल नदी, वो डिब्बा बंद पहाड़, उधर दीवार पर टंगी एक प्रकृति भी दे दो। और ये बारिश इतनी महंगी क्यों? दुकानदार बोला, ये नमी यहाँ की नहीं, दूसरे ग्रह से आई है, मंदी है, छटाक भर मंगाई है। पैसे निकालने साड़ी की कोर टटोली, चौंकी, देखा आंचल की गांठ में रुपयों की जगह पूरा वजूद मुड़ा पड़ा था।
The river, the mountain, and the bazaar. It was a Sunday, and I, holding little posterity by the hand, set out for the village bazaar. Coming upon a narrow path amidst dry and withered trees, I said to little posterity, look, this is where the village river used to be. A deep furrow in the grounds ahead swallowed all the mountains, I said. Suddenly, struck by fear, she held me tight. A graveyard, vast and sinister, lay in sight. I said to her, do you see? This is where the barns of your ancestors used to be. Little posterity ran on. We're here at the bazaar. What would you like to buy? The shopkeeper asked. Brother, a little rain, a handful of wet earth, a bottle of river, and that mountain preserve. There, hanging on that wall, a piece of nature as well. And why is the rain so dear, pray tell? The shopkeeper said, this wetness is not of here, it comes from another sphere. Times are slack, have ordered just a sack. Fumbling for money in the corner of my sari, I untied the knot only to see, in place of a few folded rupees, the crumbled folds of my entire being. The next poem is called The Grave.
कब्र। ढेर लगा दी गई मिट्टी अपने गड्ढों से पूछ रही, तुम्हारी गहराई, लंबाई, चौड़ाई क्यों बढ़ती जा रही है दिनों दिन? गड्ढा आह भरकर बताता, खोद रहे हैं वे धीरे धीरे अपनी पूरी नस्ल की कब्र।
The grave. Mud piled up on the sides asks the hollow left in the ground behind. How is it that with each passing day you become more deep, long, and wide? Heaving a sigh, the hollow says, inch by inch, they are digging the grave of our entire race. And so with those poems, we move on to the third presenter in our discussion today. And I'm really delighted to invite Ashleesha Katze, who is an activist linked to several food and farm alliances in India. She's associated with the Amrita Bhumi Center, a farmer-led agroecology school in southern India, affiliated to the Karnataka State Farmers Movement, and also La Via Campesina, the transnational movement of farmer organizations. She has completed her Masters of Science in Agroecology at Colegio de la Frontera Sur in Chiapas, Mexico, where she conducted research on how peasant movements scale up agroecology. Ashleesha, we're very delighted to have you here and also for your contribution to the book. So I hand over to you now.
Thanks so much, and it's a great pleasure to be part of this panel. And to all my Hindi speakers today, I will say Zindabad Sathya and Jai Bhim. So I have co-written my chapter with my co-traveler Kavita Srinivasan. She's a feminist activist from South India, and we look at women's land rights, particularly Dalit women's land rights in agrarian climate policy in India. So things like agroecology policy, organic policies, natural farming policies. So, and such efforts, we are kind of interested to interrogate whether these efforts are strengthening and improving Dalit women's land access. And we look at two examples, one in Tamil Nadu and one in Kerala. And the one is run by the Tamil Nadu Women's Collective, and it's a social movement effort which is linked to the women's movement, and it's a popular organization of women. And the other one is a state program, which is called Kudumbashri in Kerala. And for us, I think the conversation, any conversation about climate justice in an agrarian setting, it must engage with the question of land access, because land is the most productive resource in agriculture, and it's the most important one. And land ownership comes with many advantages to women, and it increases your bargaining power, enhances social status, allows access to state support, and very importantly, it encourages recognition of women as farmers, because in India, the definition of farmer is directly linked to land ownership. And so all state support entitlements are reserved for those who are landowners on paper. So given the fact that women are doing most of the work in agriculture, particularly Dalit women, the figure is something like 70% of women in rural India doing farming. There's a feminization of agriculture where men are leaving the countryside and women are left with the double burden of both productive and reproductive tasks. But this does not imply that women are being empowered in any way because they're doing most of the farming. It just means that their work is increasing and they're not getting any of the recognition or support that they need because, again, they're not landowners. And so today, something like 13% of the land is operated by women, which is abysmal, but not all women are equal. And the question of caste is one of the most important ones, along with other identities like age, class, marital status, education. All of these play a very fundamental role in determining where a woman stands. And the figure for Dalit women is abysmal. It's something like 1.5% of the land in India is operated by Dalit women, but that's absurd because most of the laborers in agriculture, and you go to any field, any paddy field, and you'll see they're all women, and most likely they're all Dalit women. So they are engaged in agriculture, but they are laborers. They are not recognized as cultivators, and they are not the decision makers. So that's the injustice that exists with women's land rights in rural India. And how do women access land then? So one of the ways that the 3 or 4 ways that women do access land are through inheritance, which is not possible for most Dalit women because Dalits have been prevented from owning land historically. Purchasing is again very expensive. It's not possible. It's prohibitive. Land redistribution by the state has mostly failed. And there's apathy from the state. And so finally, feminist scholars are showing, and many examples by the women's movement are considering land leasing to be an important way in which women can access land, and they're doing it in a collective fashion. So scholars like Beena Agarwal, for example, are showing that women's land leasing is very effective, and they are actually doing collective farming in a much more productive and efficient way than family farm units, for instance. So land leasing, unfortunately, is illegal in most states of India. And so it's happening informally. And so that means that women who are able to access land are doing it they don't have security. And most landowners will, they can just cancel the lease anytime and take over the land. And that's something that happens all the time. So it's really, again, another very big barrier for women to be able to access land. So the two kind of cases that we looked at, one of them is by the Tamil Nadu Women's Collective. It's a large collective, something like 100,000 women in Tamil Nadu. Majority of them are landless. Most of them are Dalit, and many of them are single women. And this collective has been experimenting with collective land leasing and collective farming. And so something like 700 women within this collective have been practicing collective agroecological farming. And they are collectivized into different sangams or self-help groups. And these sangams are then supported by the collective to access credit and to get training and to pool their resources. And so they've experienced lots of positive impacts through this support, and they do not receive any support from the state. So this is a completely social movement run effort. And then on the other program is the Kudumbashree program, which is quite an emblematic program in India, and it's a state-led program for poverty alleviation, and lots of almost all the women from the poorer households are collectivized into these self-help groups. And Kudumbashree has started a new climate resilience program where it's trying to convert 10,000 hectares into organic farming. And the way it's doing that is by supporting women's collective farming. So it's really interesting because the state is then supporting women to negotiate leases with landowners. And what we're seeing is that since 2006, there was something like 26,000 women's groups who were engaged in farming. And by 2019, the figure had gone up to 65,000 women groups. And similarly with land, with hectares, it was 17,000 hectares were under collective farming by women, and now it's something like 51,000 hectares. So there's a stark increase, and that's because the state has provided all this support, and it's playing a proactive role. And even though land leasing is illegal in Kerala, the state has recognized informal leases by women's groups. So that's really a great advantage because banks are recognizing these leases and they're providing them credit. And also the state is organizing other support like markets and trainings and providing incentives and bonuses. So these are some of the ways in which both of these programs are supporting Dalit women to access land. And some final conclusions that I think that we can draw from these two examples is that one, it's really important for state policies to have and to have states to have commitments and policies for both agroecology and land access. So we say that it's not enough to just be committed to agroecology unless we're talking about the land question, because it is the fundamental question of inequality will not be addressed then. And we're finding that collective land access is a very good way in which that can happen. And states need to then allow women as collectives to be landowners and not necessarily only individuals to be landowners. So that's something that the women's movement has been fighting for. And then state policies, of course, are not enough, even though they are an important step. We also have patriarchal norms, which are interfering with the implementation of these programs. And, both of the groups, women from both these groups have been commenting on how male community members have been coming in the way. Government officials are apathetic. Upper caste landlords usually use violence, particularly sexual violence against Dalit women, especially when they try to assert their rights. So these are all things that must be addressed. And one of the ways it's important to do that is by putting Dalit women in positions, government positions and positions of power, sensitizing men and especially supporting Dalit women's movements and grassroots efforts, because these movements are the ones that can hold governments accountable, that can stand up to any violence and abuse. And it's a very important tool for power building from below. And finally, that it's not just about land, it's also all the other kinds of support that has to be provided to women so that they can practice agroecology and actually make the land productive and benefit from it. Yeah, so this is the end of my presentation. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Ashleesha. I think in this age where there is such a push for industrial agriculture, you raise a really important point, because it is actually small scale farmers who are feeding the world right now. And this need to address the issues of land, but other access and capabilities is a critical one. So very much appreciate your intervention. Prakash, would you like to add something?
Right, thank you, Varsna. So we do have more powerful poetry coming, is on the way. So I wanted to sort of make a sort of a politics question, which I thought is better made before we get into poetry. So I really appreciate the opportunity. Both the powerful presentations that you heard from Silata and Ashleesha, they talk about how it's, the caste-based injustices are not mistakes, right? They're not things that happen like by, say by chance, or because we couldn't implement things properly. These are the most common reasons you will hear if you talk to government officials and even people like, policy scholars and so forth. But it is the structure, the way in which our institutions are structured, the way municipalities are structured, the way our land laws are made. All of these systems and institutions, they almost ensure that anything that we do with climate action will produce injustices, as long as we don't actually intervene beforehand and change those structures. So anytime you hear that, oh, we'll talk about these questions later on because, this is way too complicated. There's a lot of, it's policy stuff, it's heavy. It's nonsense. Policy stuff can be redone in different ways so that it does not produce injustices against the Adivasi, Dalit, Bahujan, women, and other marginalized groups. So I think, there's this tendency that, you keep justice as a sort of this question that we will come to later on. Let's first do the main task of policy and then we'll address justice. That is why we are in the trouble we are today, because policy-making processes are captured by market interest and political interest who do not actually care about climate change. And so if they actually cared about climate change, we've been doing these, COP meetings and circuses for 30 years, we would have already solved that. So bringing in, and Silata made this point very explicitly, and Ashleesha kind of gave you examples of how this can be done. But bringing in the majority people, the Adivasi, Dalit, Bahujan, bringing them into the policy process will actually improve the policy effectiveness. So it's not, different from thinking more about policy effectiveness and good policy making. So I just wanted to sort of reiterate that point.
Thanks, Prakash. I think that's really a fundamental issue that we have to keep at the forefront, because right now there's so much rhetoric about all this good work that people are doing, but at the end of the day, even those climate solutions will themselves entrench the injustices if we don't address them up front. So very important to keep that in mind. And as you say, we need to actually hold to a higher standard for policy, and it is possible. So that's what we need to ask for. We are now at the last set of poems that we have the privilege of sharing from Jacinta. So I will move into that. And the first one is called O City.
ओ शहर, भागते हुए छोड़कर अपना घर, भागते हुए छोड़कर अपना घर, पुआल, मिट्टी और खपरे पूछते हैं अक्सर, ओ शहर, क्या तुम कभी उजड़ते हो किसी विकास के नाम पर?
O city, leaving behind their homes, their soil, their bales of straw, fleeing the roof over their heads, they often ask, O city, are you ever wrenched by the very roots in the name of so-called progress? The next poem, The Dust of Development.
विकास की धूल, फांकती हुई विकास की धूल, दिन रात खांसती हुई जिंदगी, हृदय की उम्र सिमट गई है, आंखें उम्मीदों की दिन गिन रही उंगलियों में। अब नहीं जाते कोई कदम खेतों की ओर, वहां पैरों को लत पड़ चुकी है दौड़ पड़ने को कोयले लदे ट्रकों के पीछे पैनम के रास्तों पर। कुदाल ने नहीं चखा लंबे अरसे से किसान के कंधे में झूल खेतों गीतों का रस। निकलता है घर से चुपचाप वो अब किसी चोर की तरह। सपने दब जाते हैं हर रात, अचानक रौंद कर निकल गए किसी ट्रक के नीचे। तब अपने हिसाब से आकर जीवन की कीमत तय करती है।
The dust of development. Breathing in the dust of progress, day and night, life coughs in distress. The heart is aged before its time, and eyes, once with hope alive, are now counting their numbered days. No footsteps more are heard, plodding along towards the fields, for addicted now are those feet to chase after trucks laden with coal along the road of the Panem mines. So long has it been since the hoe has heard since the farmer his delightful song, while it swung on his shoulder along. For now the farmer creeps out of the house like a thief. Every night our dreams, crushed under the wheels of some truck running amok, then come as they please, bidders and auctioneers, to put the price tags on lives lost. And in all this much ado, many lives are left to gather dust. The next poem, No One Ever Saw Me.
किसी ने नहीं देखा मुझे, किसी ने नहीं देखा मुझे, जब आंगन की मिट्टी को सीमेंट का कवच पहनाया गया। मैं मिट्टी को समझाता रहा, मजबूत नींव के लिए जरूरी है उसका मरना। मगर मैंने देखा एक एक कर फूलों को भी मरते हुए। उस दिन से मधुमक्खियों ने छोड़ दिया मेरे आंगन में उठना बैठना। चिड़ियों ने भी मुंह फेर लिया मुझसे। बारिश और हवा भी हंसती नहीं अब खुलकर। अब आंगन में सिर्फ सन्नाटा धूप सेकने आता है और इसे उनकी नियति बताता रहता है। मैंने फूलों के साथ साथ उस दिन मधुमक्खियों चिड़ियों की भी हत्या की। मिट्टी, बारिश और हवा को तड़पाया। किसी ने नहीं देखा मुझे, सिर्फ मेरे हाथों की सफाई जानती है मेरे गुनाह कितने बड़े हैं।
No one ever saw me. No one ever saw me as the soil of the courtyard was shrouded in the armor of cement. I tried to make the soil see that it was necessary for it to die to make way for a strong foundation. But then I saw even the flowers perish one by one. From that day forth, the honeybees stopped calling in on the courtyard. The birds too turned away from me. Neither do the rain and the breeze sing any longer with joy and glee. Only dead silence visits the courtyard to bask in the sun and likes to whisper, it was but their destiny. That day I killed not flowers alone, but also the birds and the bees, and I tormented the soil, rain and breeze. No one ever saw me, only the sleight of my hands know how far beyond my sin goes. Last poem, Years of Paddy Bound by the Dam.
Just need a minute.
And again, I just want to say thank you to all the participants for continuing to be with us. After we read this poem, we will open up for a little bit of discussion before we close the session. So thank you for your patience.
बांध से बंधी धान की बालियां, तप रहा है आज फिर फूलों के मन का मरुस्थल, जलने लगा है मन गर्म रेत में, जब देखती है हल्की बारिश के बाद छींटे जा रहे हैं बीज खेत में। चंद कागज के टुकड़े थामे हाथ में, बांध के किनारे खड़ी बेतहाशा अपने खेतों को लगती है तलाशने, सालों की माँ पागलों सी हर बरसात में। शहर चकाचौंध है बांध के बन जाने से, और वह चौंक उठती है देखकर डिबरी की रोशनी में बनती अपनी ही परछाई को अंधेरी रात में। सोमा आज भूखा है, उसके खेत बन गए हैं बड़े बड़े बांध, दिख रही है देह की हड्डी सिकुड़ रही सिमट कर पेट की आंत। अब बंध रहा है एक बांध आंसुओं का, अब बंध रहा है एक बांध आक्रोश का, टूटेंगे ये बांध एक दिन जब भरेंगे उलगुलान की हुंकार, पहाड़ियों पर से साखों की डालियां मिटेंगी विस्थापित करती शक्तियां, और फिर लहलहा उठेंगी खुलकर खेतों में बांध से बंधी धान की बालियां।
Years of paddy bound by the dam. Yet again, Pullo's heart is a sweltering, blazing desert, burning within on its own hot sands, as she watches the sowing of the seeds after a light drizzle in the fields. Holding on to a few scraps of paper, standing helpless on the banks of the dam, in every rain, Sala's mother searches frenziedly for lost farmlands. The city dazzles with lights shining bright, all thanks to the building of the dam, while she startles at the very sight of her own shadow in the dark night, cast by a flickering earthen lamp. Today, Soma starves, for his fields are now massive reservoirs. The cage of his ribs protrudes through the skin, the innards shrink and shrivel within. Now a dam to hold back the welling tears. Now a dam to contain the seething rage. These dams shall burst one day for sure, when the boughs of the sakwa from the hilltops in rebellion roar, sweeping out powers that destroy and displace, and once again in the breeze will sway the ears of the paddy in their majesty, enclosed in mud and mounds, no more by dams. Jacinta, thank you very much for these poems that you have shared with us. They truly speak, I think, to the heart for all of us. I don't know if you have a chance and if you want to say anything. Srilata, would you do the translation?
Yes, of course. Jacinta जी आप अपनी बात रखिए, मैं कोशिश करूंगी ट्रांसलेट करने के लिए।
Okay, मैं थोड़ा ऐसे टूटे फूटे इंग्लिश में भी बोल सकती हूँ. So, Johar to everyone, and thank you so much for English recite. And I would like to say that when I stay in grassroots and when I stay in city, there is a very I can feel that in grassroots people, those who are so much affected because of this so-called development, and they are continuously in grassroots, they are struggling to save forest, land and nature, and very painfully they are struggling. And when I come to city, I feel that kind of pain people doesn't have, and they don't understand when in the because of this so-called development, when people lose their land, their everything, and very worse life they get instead of that, instead of development. So I feel that sentiment, that feeling, that pain, that experience, people, those who are not confront that kind of situation, for them it is very hard to understand. So sometimes when I stay in grassroots and with people, I can feel what kind of mental trauma and struggle and very different kind of sentiments they go through. It is very hard when so it is very easy to discuss or maybe to debate about climate change or climate justice, but when everybody can will feel that pain and feel that about grassroots people, how they are giving their life and they are every day they are struggling, their family, their children, everybody is participating, that I feel it is very different. And when in city people in seminar they talk about these issues, I don't feel that whether they are aware or not, whether they are feeling that same kind of struggle or pain. So I feel in India, in Northeast, in South, in Chhattisgarh, in Jharkhand, in Odisha, very people are struggling to save nature. And in whole India, I can feel, I can see discussions are going on, but people are not coming together. And that I feel, when grassroots people and intellectuals, writers, and people, those who can, talk behalf of them and can talk about policies and can affect, politics and powerful people, then, and they, when they will come together, that will be very, very great help, not only for Dalit Adivasi, but for whole human being, I feel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jacinta. I think you are really getting to the heart of the problem of partly where we don't see each other, but also how we have managed to become so disconnected from each other, so that we no longer see that one person's struggle is also our struggle. And if we are to actually move forward, it is only when we do it collectively in solidarity with each other that it will work, but also to taking the time to listen and hear what people are living with and what people are experiencing. We have about 7 minutes left, and there was one question by Subud in the Q&A, as well as a request to read a poem by Banwala. So I would like to just firstly take the question that was put into the Q&A to the audience, to the speakers. And the first is about the idea of why we have failed to sensitize the general masses regarding deteriorating environment, particularly forest, water, and air and surroundings. Everyone is planning for a future in terms of income and wealth creation, but the issues of environment and climate change have not yet able to sensitize the common masses. So talking about the situation in Delhi, but largely this question around why the environmental costs of this kind of wealth creation is so invisible to the general population. Would anyone like to reflect on that question from Subud?
Yeah, I could take that up. So thank you, Subodh, for this very thoughtful question. One, I mean, the standard answer is that environmental problems are framed in a way that do not actually speak to the concerns of majority of people. So, you're always talking about tigers or polar bears. Majority of people have never seen a tiger or a polar bear. Many people have not even seen, anyway. So that's the straightforward answer, is that the way we talk about environment has been sort of exoticized, has been presented in a way so that it's something that, you know, powerful rich people do. But I think I'd also like to reflect with all of you on another sort of way of thinking about this, which is that, you know, in India and in many countries throughout the world, including in the global north, there's not a public debate on many questions. There's not, I mean, in India, we, you know, forget about environment. The biggest pollution that we have experienced, you know, society as a whole has been committing and experiencing is the pollution of caste-based system, right? And we never talk about it, right? And this is right in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our streets, and, you know, so-called manual scavenging still continues, and we don't talk about it. So I would say the larger problem for us in India is that we don't have any kind of public debate or discussion. Now, Amartya Sen has said that, you know, Indians are supposed to be argumentative Indians. And I've always thought that this was some, you know, some Bengali Bhadralok perspective, that, you know, of Indians being like argumentative Indians. We need to be more argumentative. We need to create more public discussions and public forums. And as Jacinta said, you know, we need to speak to and come together with the masses, with the social movements, with Adivasi groups and Dalit groups. So I hope that twofold answer is of some, you know, starting conversation.
Thank you, Prakash. So we have 2 hands up and very little time left. So I will ask Anwala, who has had his hand up for the longest time, if he could share his poem. And I think, yeah, Srilata has invited you in so that you can. And then we'll take a last point from Dipali before we close.
Can I say you?
Yes, please.
First of all, Namaskar, Ram Ram, Happy Diwali. Can I speak in Hindi? पेड़ का मानव के साथ संवाद, मैं एक बीज हूं आपकी तरह ही, जमीन चाहिए मुझे भी आपकी तरह, मैं भी अपनी खोल से बाहर आने को आतुर हूं आपकी तरह, मुझे भी चाहिए तपन संयम की तरह, जल हवा तेज आकाश भी बनेंगे जब साधन, खाद से करोगे जब आराधन, मैं अंकुरित होता हुआ खिल उठूंगा आपकी तरह, कलियां फूल और फिर फल आपकी तरह, आप भी मूलाधार से टूटकर पहुंचते जब सहस्रार तक, खिल उठता है समग्र अस्तित्व, विराट व्यक्तित्व पाते हो तब परमात्मानंद, वैसी ही यात्रा है हमारी, करते रहो रोपण मगर स्नेह सिंचन भी, आप भी अवसर की तलाश में और मैं भी मौके की तलाश में. Thank you for giving chance.
शुक्रिया भंवरलाल जी, आपका पोएट्री शेयर करने के लिए बहुत शुक्रिया.
Thank you so much. We are really at the end of time, but there is one final question from Dipali, just to ask about hope in the grassroots movements, especially in the farmer protests. And I think that that's a good question to end on. So if I can ask each of the panelists to maybe reflect a little bit on where you see hope, we will use that as our final closing. So maybe we can start with Ashleesha.
Sure, thank you. I think I see hope. Honestly, I see hope only in grassroots movement because I have lost hope in the government, and already Prakash was talking about COP and how terrible it is and nothing has been achieved. And so I think it is the grassroots movement and also the farmers' protests. And not only are these important in the realm of climate change, but also now we have authoritarianism, fascism, and if there's anything that can, challenge it, I think it has to come from people's movement. So I definitely see hope in that. Thanks.
Thanks, Ashleesha. Prakash?
people's movement, definitely, as Jacinta said, I think we have to sort of start looking at the long haul. At least in India, we are talking about 50 years of conversations, engagements, mobilizations. There was another sort of Hindi question that Babalalji asked about this cement factory coming up in his area. And these things will continue to happen. And the displacements and the exploitation that Adivasis and Dalits have faced, this circle of exploitation will expand. It will capture more and more of India's, now they are maybe middle and lower middle classes or whatever. Gradually, they are going to lose out. So we are going to we'll have to get into a long-term process of rethinking who we are as a society. So in addition to Ashleesha's and Jacinta's comment earlier, I think we need to start society-wide conversations and really become argumentative in many, many ways.
Thank you, Prakash. Jacinta, do you want to add anything?
I would like to say that grassroots people have hope, and they are very hopeful in humanity, beyond caste, beyond border, beyond country. They believe that as human beings, and they will come together and they will support. So with this hope and hope in nature, continuously they struggle, I think. And thank you.
And so now I will give the last word to Srilata to first say her contribution and thoughts on hope, but also to close our session as we come to the end of our period now. So Srilata, I hand to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Vasna. I think I agree with Prakash and Ashleesha and Jacinta that hope is definitely at the grassroots and in people's movements. And I think I particularly draw hope from instances of solidarity. So when I see, Nodeep Kaur, who's a Dalit trade unionist, joining the farmers' protest and speaking against, corporatization, speaking against fascism, when I see, environmental groups also talking about, Muslim women's rights, or Muslim women's groups talking about Dalit women's rights and Adivasi women's rights, or, Adivasi groups talking about urban issues, and, coming together, this kind of, cross-cutting solidarity. When I see instances of that, I think that really gives me hope, because as much as we theorize about intersectionality and such, in our universities, much of it, actually plays out in the grassroots movements. And when those kinds of examples stand out to me, I think that makes me feel really hopeful. So yes, I think that brings us to the end of the session today. I want to first of all say thank you to Vasna for being such a great anchor for the session today, and for your wonderful reading of poetry. Thank you very much. It really added, a special touch to the event. I also need to acknowledge Bhumika Chawla D'Souza, who has done this exceptional translation of Jacinta's poetry. Thank you to Jacinta for sending us these recordings way ahead of time and then resending them because of internet issues. I'm very glad we could have those and we could play those, and also that you could join us today live as well. Thank you to Ashleesha for joining us today and giving us your thoughts and contributions. Thank you to Prakash for putting this volume together, as well as joining the event today. And last but not the least, I need to acknowledge the ESRC, which is Economic and Social Research Council of the UK. This event is a part of ESRC Festival of Social Science, and this festival is ongoing throughout the month of November. There is a focus on environmental issues given the background of COP in Glasgow, but there are also lots of other issues being discussed as part of the events. Go check it out. Thank you to the administrative team at the School of Global Affairs at King's College London, which is my host institute, and I'm representing King's College today, which is one of the partner institutes in the ESRC Festival of Social Science. And thank you very much to our very, very engaged audience for all your thoughts and questions and comments, and for your participation in the program today. Thank you all, and we will send you a message when the recording is ready and uploaded to YouTube. Thank you very much.
Great. So on that note, we end the session. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. We'll see you around somewhere.
Yes. Let's keep talking about environmental justice and caste, and let's keep doing more solidarity work.
Absolutely. Yes. Bye for now.